Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Alana Steinhain. I am sitting in the office in my apartment with some games behind me, but I think that's a good reminder that this shir is being recorded on Hanukkah. Reason why it's such an important reminder is because our topic today is something that you would not necessarily think is the most Sanhedrin-like topic. Comes up on Sanhedrin Yud Bet Amud Bet, and I loved that people ended up learning it during Hanukkah. The topic is Tuma Utra B'tzibur. The notion that if most of the tzibur is tameh, or if most of the kohanim who would sacrifice are tmeim, or if the kli sharet became, or the klei sharet became tmeim, we would still give certain korbanot, despite the tuma. Now, the reason why I think this is an interesting Hanukkah topic is because if there is a concept that if most people are tameh, and to be clear, we mean ritual impurity related to death, contact with a corpse, or if most the Kohanim are tmeim, again, ritual impurity related to a corpse, to matmeit, or the klei sharet, the vessels that you would use to do these things are tmeim, we would still do certain korbanot. Kind of raises the question of why the Gemara seems to indicate that at the time of Hanukkah, they needed to find a pach shemen that had shemen tahor in it. Why did they need to find tahor shemen? And in fact, this is the question that the Pnei Yehoshua, Rabbi Yehoshua Falk, asks. He says, why do they have to find shemen tahor? Tuma, Utra, B'tzibur. Right? So we're going to come back to that question, but I want to talk more about the concept of itself of Tuma Utra B'tzibur, because it's not so simple. And in fact, what we saw in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Yud Bet Amud Bet, was talking about the context of, perhaps being Ma'aber the Shana, perhaps adding a month, intercalating, adding a month to the calendar, which of course is a function of Beit Din, in order to avoid Tumat Mate, meaning if people are Tmeim Lamate, maybe you would, like if Rov Hatzibur was Tmeim Lamate, maybe you would try to push Pesach off by a month, right? So that's where the conversation starts happening about whether Tuma Hutra B'tzibur. But you may notice it didn't say Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, it said Tuma Dehuya B'tzibur, right? This is the old argument that we have about Chilul Shabbat in order to do Pikuach Nefesh. Maybe I shouldn't call it Chilul Shabbat, but overriding Shabbat, doing a Malacha in order to do Pikuach Nefesh. Do we say Pikuach Nefesh, Shabbat is Hutra, like completely kind of obliterated halachically in the face of saving a life? Or do you say that Shabbat is Dehuya? Shabbat is only pushed off, not obliterated completely, right? Same kind of question here. Do we say that when most of the community is Tameh, Tmeim Lamate, when most of the Kohanim are Tmeim Lamate, or when the Klei Sharet are Tmeim Lamate, we say, give that Korban Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, it's completely allowed? Or do we say it's merely Dehuya, that the Tuma is pushed back in favor of something else? And the nafkamina, the consequences, the practical consequences would be if you can find, the tahor version or can do it in the tahor way, then maybe lechatchila, you can't just do it in the tamei way. And another nafkamina is, do you need some sort of kapara on the fact that you did this bitum? But we'll get to all of that. But either way, you can see why it's a really good Hanukkah. It's a really good Hanukkah question in Gemara. So what I want to do is I want to look at the source of the concept of Tuma Hutra or Dehuya B'tzibur. And I want to get a sense of what the two different sources that are offered for Tumah Hatra B'tzibur or Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur, what they each seem to be focused on. Okay. Now notice we haven't said what kind of korban can override. We will get there. Okay, so first of all, what I have on the top is just the list of Tumah Hatra B'tzibur, who's Tameh, what's Tameh, right? So it's Rov HaTzibur, it's Rov HaKohanim, or it's the Klei Sharet, right? The kelim that you use for sacrifice. Then I have our Gemara in Sanhedrin, Yud Bet Amud Bet, talking about this in Medias Res question of Ibur Shana, can it be for the purpose of Tum'ah? If so, does that show you that people think that Tum'ah is only Dechuya B'tzibur? Because what you really want is if you can push off the month, you will, right? But suffice it to say. Then I have the question of the Pnei Yoshua about Hanukkah, okay? And we're going to get back to it. Then I have something else about building Beit HaMikdash Bizman Hazeh. We'll talk about that later. Okay. But now on to our, conversation about where Tumah Hatra B'tzibur comes from. Now, there's one more little piece that I need to share before we see the Mikorot, before we see the Makor, meaning the source for Tumah Hatra B'tzibur, the biblical source, which is we need to talk about the tzitz for a second. So the tzitz is that golden front piece that the Kohen Gadol wears that says Kodesh LaHashem. And the Torah in Shemot, Perek Kafchet, Pasuk Lamechet says, Vaya al Metzach Aharon, it will be on Aaron's forehead. V'nasa Aharon et Avon HaKodashim, and Aaron is going to lift up, raise up. It's interesting, the modern JPS translation, like the most recent, says take away the sin that comes from sacred things. Asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael, that the Jews are going to consecrate and make hekdesh. V'chol matnot kodshehem, from all of the matanot that they give as kodshim, meaning all of the donations. Vaya al mitzchot tamid leratzon lahem lifnei Hashem, and it will always be on the Kohen Gadol's forehead or on Aaron's forehead as ratzon, right? To get God's will, God's acceptance for them before God. Okay. So the tzitz does something to gain acceptance and does something to deal with Avon HaKodashim. And when you look at the Mishnah in Menachot, Perek Gimel, Mishnah Gimel, it tells you, I want to tell you a little bit more about the Ratzon piece. What is the Ratzon? What is the acceptance that the tzitz is trying to get for Bnei Yisrael? So it's talking about an example where somebody's giving a Korban Mincha. So for Korban Mincha, you have a kometz, you have a little pinch that you squeeze. What happens if that little pinch of flour that you squeezed becomes tameh, okay? And you gave it anyway. Nitma hakometz v'hikrivo. If that kometz, that little pinch, became tameh and you gave it anyway as a korban, hatzitz miratzeh. That tzitz is going to liratzon, is going to appease Hashem for that, and even the rest, the stuff that's not tameh, can be eaten by the kohen. Yatsav hikrivo. But if the Kohen took the kometz out of the area in the Mikdash where they're supposed to be and gave it as a korban, ein hatzitz meratzeh, tzitz can't help you. Shatzitz meratzeh latameh, bein meratzeh layotze. The tzitz can gain ritzui, can gain acceptance for somebody sacrificing something with ritual impurity, but cannot gain acceptance for leaving the designated area. Okay. Suffice it to say, what's happening here is we seem to be talking about any korban mincha. We seem to be talking about a situation where something becomes tameh in the middle. Okay. So this is sort of like the equivalent. Well, let's just leave it as that. This is going to be important in our discussion in the Gemara of Tumah Hatra B'tzibur. Okay. So just hold it in your mind. We're not doing a full analysis of that Mishnah, but it's part of the conversation. So on to our first source for where we know Tumah Hatra B'tzibur or Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur. Here we go. Titanu Rabbanan, rabbis taught in a Braita, Vaydaber Moshe et Mo'adei Hashem, right? Moshe spoke about the Moadei Hashem. Now, Moed, we say, means a holiday, but Moed is also a time, an appointed time. Matamud Lomar. Why does Parshat Emor, why does Vayikra Kav Gimel have to start the holidays with that intro? Because we only learned concerning the Korban Tamid and the Korban Pesach, Shene'emar Behu B'mo'ado, about which the Torah says it should be given B'mo'ado, in its appointed times. B'mo'ado afilu b'Shabbat, in its appointed time, even if it's Shabbat, right? And you would think that certainly some of the activities you do to be Makriva Korban, they violate Shabbos. Nope. Certain Korbanot are B'mo'ado. Korban Pesach says B'mo'ado. Korban Tamid, B'mo'ado. Has to be even on Shabbat. Also B'mo'ado v'afilu b'tum'ah. Also B'mo'ado, even if there's ritual impurity. Now, not even if one person is ritually impure. Pesach is the perfect example. You can't do a Korban Pesach if you are Tamei Lamet as an individual. But even if the masses, either of Kohanim, or the Klei Sharet, or the people, are pure, because it has to be B'mo'ado, because it has to be in its time, afilu b'tum, right? So the Gemara says, Shar Korbanot Tzibur Minayin. How do I know that other communal offerings also should be given even on Shabbat, even on even Betuma? Shneimar Eila Tasu Lashem B'Moadeichem. So you have a pasuk that uses the word Moed again. Okay, let's keep going. Minayin leRabot Omer v'Karevimo. What about the Korban Omer and the animals that are given alongside of it? The Shtei Halechem v'Karevimam. What about the 2 loaves of bread on Shavuot and the animals that are given with it? How do you know? Even on Shabbat, even with Tumah, Talmud Lomar, as it says, Vaydaber Moshe et Moadei Hashem el Bnei Israel. Right? God spoke the Moadei Hashem, beginning of the list of Moadim, as we would say in Vayikra Kaf Gimel, to the Jewish people, Hakatuv Kva'o Moed Echad Lekulam. Right? The pasuk designates that there is an appointed time for all of them. Okay, so all of these things, even on Shabbat, even B'tumah. And the Gemara says, V'chol Hani Lamali. Why do I need all of those different derivations? One for Omer, one for this one for this one. De'ikat of Rahman Tamid, I might have thought that if the Torah says about the Korban Tamid, the daily offering b'moado, that can override Shabbos, that can override Tumah. Havamina Tamid shekain tadir v'chalil. I might have thought the Korban Tamid, that thing is constant. Of course it overrides Shabbos. Of course it overrides Tumah b'tzibur. Aval Pesach? Lo, but not Pesach. Once a year. Lo. We shouldn't allow it to override a big, a mass Tumah event. Kamash Malan comes to teach us? Nope, not true. And if the Torah had only told us Moed about Korban Tamid and about Pesach, Havamina Hani U Yesh Behen Sad Chamor. I might have thought, well, actually, these two, the Tamid and the Korban Pesach, they are actually very machmir korbanot. The Tamid is Tadir v'Chalil. The Tamid is, it's constant and it's Chalil. It's an Ola. It gets completely consumed. And that's very chamor. That's very strict. Pesach, shehu anish karet. And Korban Pesach, you don't give Korban Pesach, you get karet. So maybe for those, Tumah should be able to be overridden because they have a set time to give them. But other communal offerings, I might have said, it's okay, we'll do it another time. Or not do it. Katav Rahmana, therefore the Torah says, in the Moed. Then there's more. And if it had only said this latter, Latter, I would have thought it's only 4 korbanot zibur that come to give people expiation. But the Omer and the Shtei Lechem that don't come to give expiation, they're actually there to allow us to eat new grains, lo, maybe Tuma shouldn't be overridden. Kamash Malan comes to teach us that it is. A little bit more. If it only told us about the Omer and the Shtei Lechem that can override Tuma, can override Shabbos, Havamina Adrabah. I would have thought the opposite. Omer Shtei Lechem, the Alime Debayin Lahatir. These things are very strong. And of course, they override Tuma because they're coming to allow us to eat new grain. So even Betuma, you have to do it. But I would have thought of Al-Hanach, these other things, no. Kamash Malan comes to teach us that yes. Okay? Fine. So bottom line, I want to just analyze this for a second. The makor here, the source here is how important it is to do each of these korbanot in their time. And if you don't have the Kohanim to do it, you don't have the people to do it, you don't have the Klei Sharet to do it, it's not going to get done. And each of these, they need to get done b'moadam. That's the focus. The focus is the korban needing to get done. Okay? There's another way that you could look at this, which is instead of focusing on the fact that the korban needs to get done, perhaps we focus on the fact that the people are actually the focus and they need the opportunity to do. But we'll get to that in a minute. There's one layer that the Gemara adds. The Gemara says, Savruha, let's talk about this. Alma Tuma Dechuya Hibitzibur. Tuma is not Hutra Bitzibur. It's not just allowed anything goes. It's Dechuya, meaning Ubaya Tzitz Liratzot. You need the tzitz, you need that golden front piece from the Kohen Gadol in order to help people, to allow it to be accepted. Not to help people, to allow it to be accepted. And then the Gemara says, and by the way, you should just know, Delekatana deshamet leida amar tuma hutra b'tzibor, ela Rabbi Yehuda. It's only Rabbi Yehuda who thinks that tuma can be hutra b'tzibor. Okay, so that's just like a little add on there. But suffice it to say, what we're seeing is that the idea of tuma hutra b'tzibor is how important it is to do something in its time. And therefore, even though this Gemara seems to focus on korbanot tzibor, which we know have to be done in their time, there are also certain korbanot yachid that have to be given, like certain korbanot that the Kohen gives on Yom Kippur, that also Tuma is Hutra for them. So it's not necessarily Tuma Hutra, but Tzibor is because of the Tzibor. It's even when the Tzibor, or especially when the Tzibor is a certain way, the focus is really, did these korbanot need to get done in their time? And that's the way the Rambam puts it in Hilchot Biat HaMikdash, Dalid Tet. Kol korban she'ein kavua lo zman, any korban that doesn't have a set time, eino doche lo et haShabbat velo et hatuma. It does not override Shabbos or ritual impurity. Shim lo yakriv hayom, yikariv lamachar, ulamacharat machar. Because if it doesn't have a set time, if it doesn't get done today, it'll get done another day. No problem. But v'chol korban shekavua lo zman, but any korban that has a set time, bein korban tzibor, bein korban yachid, doche et haShabbat, ve'doche et hatuma. But anything that has a set time, whether it's a korban of the community, it's a korban of the individual, it notice he uses the word doche. It pushes off tum'ah, and he makes sure that you know, below kol tum'ot udoche, it doesn't push off all tum'ah, ela tumat hamit levada. And then he goes on to say, actually, let me see. 1 second. Actually, kol korbanot hatzibor kavua zmanam. Lefichach kulan dochin et haShabbat ve'et tumat hamit. And he makes clear, you know how they used to say, all squares are parallelograms, but not all parallelograms are squares, something like that. I know I'm a little all quadrilaterals. All squares are quadrilaterals, but not all quadrilaterals are squares. There we go. It's a similar kind of thing. All korbanot tzibor can override tuma b'tzibor, but not everything that can override. There's a broader inclusion of things that can override tuma b'tzibor, and that is anything that's b'moado, even korbanot yachid, anything that has to be given in its time. So the focus there is really on the system of the Mikdash, the year of the Mikdash, the calendar of the Mikdash. Now let's see a different take on it. When you look in the Gemara in Psachim a little bit earlier, Psachim Samach Vav Amud Bet, there's a different suggestion that's given for how we know Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur. Its focus is different. Ashkechan Tamid Upesach Dedahu Shabbat. We know that the Korban Tamid and the Korban Pesach can override Shabbat. Dedahu Tumah Minalan. How do we know that they can override Tumah? Amar ki hechid of Pesach mitamid le'inyan Shabbat, just like Pesach is learned from the Korban Tamid for the purposes of overriding Shabbat. Hachinami yalef tamid mi Pesach le'inyan Tumah. Likewise, it can be learned from Pesach regarding overriding Tumah. Then the Gemara says, no. We have a more basic question. U Pesach gufei minalan. How do you know that Pesach, the Korban Pesach, can override Tumah b'tzibur, right? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, to Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Ish kiyet tameh lenefesh." Right? What are we talking about? We're talking about the people who come in Bamidbar Perek Tet and say Lama Nigara. Why should we be left out of being able to give the Korban Pesach? And they're given Pesach Sheni as their option, right? And what we find out is if there is an individual who is tameh lenefesh, meaning they're tameh lamet, then they'll do Pesach Sheni instead of Pesach Rishon. But ish nidche lePesach Sheni, an individual or a number of individuals, right, can be is pushed to Pesach Sheni. Ve'ein tzibor nidchin lePesach Sheni, but the tzibor is not pushed to Pesach Sheni. Ella avdei b'tumah. Rather, they do the Korban Pesach b'tumah. Now, what I like about this is that the focus is so much on the tzibor that's coming from this, right? Like, what is a tzibor? It's not what happens if the Korban Pesach doesn't get done this year. It's more like, who are the Jewish people if they don't get to do the Korban Pesach this year, right? Like, who would we be? And that's also an interesting Hanukkah question, because one of the things in one of the books of Maccabees, it describes that when they came out after their victory, they took lulavim and went to the Mikdash with their lulavim because they hadn't done Sukkot properly in the Mikdash. So the idea of like, who are we if we would miss Korban Pesach? Not individuals, but if the Jewish people miss the Korban Pesach, what year? What does that mean for who we are? Nope, can't happen. Tuma Hutra B'Tzibor. And it's interesting. This is kind of a funny way into it, but there is this kind of approach that seems to be so focused on the people themselves, like as a people, as a collective. And it comes from the Ramban's Pirush on the Torah to Bamidbar Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Yud Tet, because there's a discussion that after the war with Midian, there's a focus on Tumat Mate, and that they should actually do a Tara process for themselves. Okay. It says, Atem, make sure I get the Chanu michutz lamachaneh shivat yamim, kol hareg nefesh, anybody who killed anyone, or v'chol hanogeh b'chalal, anybody who touched a corpse has to be outside of the camp for 7 days. And titchatau b'yom hashlishi u'b'yom hashvi'i atem u'shvichem. You have to and even your captives have to, on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, go through the hazah mechatat, right? Go through the sprinkling of the waters to make you tahor. And the Ramban asks implicitly asks a simple question. He doesn't really ask it as a question, but it's sort of like, ma pitom, why are they now suddenly worried about people going through a Tara process after war? We don't see that with Sichon and Og. How come that happens here? And so the Ramban says, "V'chein b'din hatuma shehi ziram ata." Let me tell you about the din, the concern with tuma, that now is when Moshe seems to be concerned with it. And notice, by the way, even though the pasuk that I cited was pasuk Yutet, the Ramban is on pasuk of Gimel, if you want to look it up. Vatem chanu michutz lamachana shivat b'im legomer, then quotes pasuk Yutet. Ki b'melchemet Sichon ve'og ba hayu kol Yisrael. In the war against Sichon and Og, not Midian, in the war against Sichon and Og, everyone was involved. B'tuma hutra b'tzibur. And we're not going to worry about tuma. Now, this is a little bit funny because what do you mean they don't have to go through a Tara process? So there are people who disagree with the Ramban and push back at the Ramban. But it is interesting what he's saying. He said, when we're all in that together, tuma hutra b'tzibur, this is what we are right now. This is what we are, and it's okay that this is what we are, right? And you know, the I can't help but think about how relevant the concept of Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur is for the Jewish people, having been involved in fighting a war and been exposed to death in so many ways over the last, year plus. It's almost like this concept of Toma Hutra B'Tzibur, that even if the majority of us are Tmeim Lamed, even if we are going through a trauma, really, right? We still can do the Korbanot, whether it's because the calendar must march on, the calendar must be, because the calendar itself matters. It's how we keep time through Avodat Hashem, or because we matter and we need to be able to do these things, especially even when we're going through a really hard time that engages us in Tumah, it's the opposite. Tumah is the opposite of Kiddusha. And yet we're being allowed because this is who we are and this is what we are right now. And we need to be able to access that Avodat Hashem. We can't be without it. So let's go back to our question from the Pnei Yoshua. The Pnei Yoshua asks very smartly, why do they need a Pach Shemen Tahor? V'lechora yesh litmoa kol Torah Hanes kol Torah Hanes ze lama. What do you need this nace for? Of finding a Pach Shemen with the Chotam of the Kohen Gadol? Taha kaimalan tuma hutra b'tzibur. Don't we hold the halacha that tuma is allowed b'tzibur? By the way, I should say most people actually hold the halacha tuma dechuya b'tzibur, meaning if you can get better, you should get better, and you need the tzitz in order to get you ritzui, which is why we looked at Mishnah. But we'll go to that in a minute. Just use shemet tamei. Ubishlam alamanda amar dechuya b'tzibur nicha. If you think that tuma is only dechuya b'tzibur, then I understand, right? Then shapir k'tzat. Then it makes more sense that lechatchila you really want shemen tahor, right? Masha'ein kein lemanda amar hutra b'tzibur, right? If you think tuma is hutra b'tzibur completely, then dafilu hadui lo hadrina. You don't even have to look for other shemen tahor. Just take whatever shemen you can find, right? Kidi'ita b'yoma, as you find in the Gemara in Yoma, which we didn't look at. Im kain kashatuva is a bigger question. Now, what's beautiful, his answer is beautiful. Says, even according to the Tuma Hutra B'Tzibur people, L'kach nir'eh di'ikar hanes lo ne'asa ela l'hodia lahem chibat hamakom alehem. Says, I think they could have used tamei oil. But the whole nace of finding shemen tahor shows God's love for them. Kida'ashkachan, as we find shenasa nes hatamid shalonim sapsul ba'omer v'shtei halechem, like we find concerning other nisim that are described regarding the korbanot. V'ho'il, meaning that they were flawless, so to speak, in certain situations. V'it rechish lehu nisa be'ikar ha'inyan shenigalu ge'ula shlema miyad sonehem And the biggest nace is that they were able to have a full redemption from their enemies. Shahayu Omrim Israel would say to the Jews, Kitvu al Keren Hashor she'ein lachem chelek belokei Yisrael. Right? You have to write on the on the Keren Hashor, on the horn of the ox that even like a baby might be drinking from, that you have no chilek in the God of Israel, right? And the gazru shmadiot, and they made shmads against us, meaning persecutions, things we weren't allowed to do. ועכשיו שנגאלו ונעשה להם נס גדול, and now that they were redeemed and a great miracle was made for them, ששלטו בשונאיהם, that they were able to rule over their enemies, לכך נעשה להם גם כנס בעניין הנרות, therefore this nace was done for them with the nerot, שהוא עדות לישראל שהשכינה שרה בהם. It's testimony that God is among them. I think this is beautiful too, right? Even if Toma Hotra B'tzibor, the idea that you could find something unsullied, that you can find something pure, is supposed to be some sort of indication that God is still among us, right? How much would we yearn and pine today for some sort of knowledge of security in our brit with Hashem, given this past year plus? I mean, who really wouldn't um, pine for that from a religious perspective? And therefore, Rabbi Falk reads it in that way, which is pretty beautiful. One last piece, which I think is also significant to consider, is there were those, and I put it on the source sheet. We're not going to read it inside because we're up to time and I don't want to overwhelm people. There were plenty of people who suggested, I shouldn't say plenty, there were people who suggested that the possibility of building a Bayit Shlishi or offering korbanot actually rests on the concept of Tomahotra B'tzibur. You don't have to actually find a red heifer. You don't have to find a para aduma to help make us all tehorim from tumat meat today in order to give korbanot. Tumat B'tzibur, most people are tame anyway, and as long as it's a korban that is supposed to be given at a certain time, you should be able to do it. And what's interesting is it ends up getting into a back and forth of some people who say, no, 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 Tuma is only dechuya, so you shouldn't first and foremost do this when you're tame, or no, 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 it's only dechuya and you need the tzitz in order to be meratzeh, and we don't have the tzitz. But suffice it to say, from a Hanukkah standpoint, where the focus is so much the ability to re-engage the Kodesh after a long battle, I think we can appreciate and should appreciate the concept of trying to figure out how to reach for Kiddusha, even as we have a lot of Tomat Mate pulling us down. And I guess that's the message that I would want to leave with. Happy Hanukkah to anybody who listens to this on Hanukkah, and I hope you had a meaningful Hanukkah to those who listen to it after. Thanks, everybody.